Book 2, Part 13, Chapter 16. Jonathan's phone rang, and I turned, having the sudden urge to yank it from his hands and bite it in half. I was in a foul mood, and that little device was not helping. He looked at the screen, then at me. "It's your father," he stated as he hit the button. I gave a low growl and turned to look out the window, although I let my ears turn back, just in case. "Yes, it appears to be completely secure," he stated, and Aunt Mary gave a small sigh. I turned and looked at her, and she smiled back at me. Of course they would have cleared this all with my dad first. I could see her sneaking me off for a run. I could almost see Jonathan doing it. But Michael and Martin would have locked us all in a closet if my dad told them no. "The place is as tight as Fort Knox," she huffed, obviously not liking her ideas being questioned. Jonathan looked over at me. "Yes, of course," he stated, and I let out a much louder growl this time. Like Michael, I wanted my dad to know I wasn't happy with him and what happened to Paige. I may not be able to change his mind, but I could make things very uncomfortable for both of them, and I planned to. "I had planned on letting her run as long as she needs to, sir," he stated, and this time I turned around and faced him. "What, am I on a time limit now?" I hissed, letting him hear my thoughts. His gray eyes met with mine, and a small amount of guilt kicked in. I wasn't mad at him. As far as I could tell, he hadn't known about Paige until it was too late. I arched my neck and nuzzled his arm, which made him smile. I liked seeing him smile. "Yes, I understand. Mr. Dons has the security and is calling in his day crew to help out." "Great," I huffed and laid down on the seat. Now a total stranger was waking up workers, disrupting their entire schedule, just so I could run. No, I thought, just so they can keep an eye on me when I ran. My ears flattened. They didn't need to go to all this trouble. If it was a game reserve, there would be very little there to threaten my safety. They were worried about me taking off. My lips curled and the growl grew again. Jonathan shot me a look that was both understanding and warning at the same time. I snorted and turned away. He lowered his hand onto the seat with the phone on it. "Raina?" I heard my dad's voice, and I turned to the shiny box. I ignored it and turned away again. "Raina, I want you to promise me that you'll be very careful out there. I won't be able to get there before you do." When I still didn't answer, he sighed. "I know you're upset, sweetheart." That got a snort out of me. Upset? That was an understatement. I was ticked. "I'll be coming over later, and you and I will have a talk about all of this then." It will be a very one-sided talk, I thought, and ignored Jonathan as he shifted. Yeah, I didn't say that with the private part of my mind, but I didn't care at this point. "Jonathan," came my dad's voice through the speakerphone, "before you let her out there, I want 2 things." I turned around and looked at the phone that he had left down near my head. "I want that place scouted with security everywhere. And," I thought, "and I want a promise from Raina that she will be safe." That pause translated to that she won't run off. I growled again, and this time Jonathan put the phone to his ear, pushing a button so we couldn't all hear him anymore. A promise that I wouldn't run off. I huffed and snorted hard, shaking my head. I caught Aunt Mary looking at me with kindness and pity, and I had to turn away, now facing the back of the seat. How utterly humiliating. Jonathan finally hung up and slipped the phone back into his pocket. "And where is my phone?" I asked him, looking up and almost glaring at him. "It's back at our place," he stated, his eyes saying more than his words did. Great. I was never going to have my own phone now. Then Aunt Mary shifted. "I will call Paige while you are on your run and check on her," she stated, stiffening her back against the men in the car. I turned and sat up, looking at her, the hope in my eyes. She smiled. "It's the least I can do after what—" She didn't finish her sentence, and I glared at Michael as he stole a quick glance in the rearview mirror. He turned his eyes back to the road, but I think I saw his shoulders sag a little. Good. I thought Jonathan might say something, tell her it wasn't a good idea, but he didn't. I let my tongue flop out of my mouth, and my eyes smiled at her. For whatever reason, she wouldn't get involved in the situation between my father and my pack, but she was still an ally, and I was grateful for that. Jonathan looked over at me. "Hungry?" My head shook, and he nodded. "Well, you will be after this run. I should have thought to bring some steaks with us." "Perhaps," Aunt Mary started carefully, looking at me. If you have," she shrugged. "It is a game reserve, after all." When my ears perked up, she shrugged. "I am sure Ronald wouldn't mind you—" "Oh," I laughed, giving a happy bark. She looked at Jonathan, who looked at me, both waiting. "I can't take down anything too big by myself," I stated, "but if there's a rabbit or something small, I can feed myself." That last comment was out of pride. He gave the information to Aunt Mary, who smiled. "I had no doubt that you could. I am sure he will be happy to allow it." She winked at me, and my darn table slapped into the back of the seat several times. "Ah, here we are now," she stated, and I turned quickly and pushed my nose towards the window. Out of spite, I put my paw on the control panel to lower the window. When it didn't budge, I growled deeply and heard Aunt Mary whisper over the front seat. "Surely you can let her take in the scents once we are through the gate," she chuckled. We rolled up to a small gatehouse, and Michael rolled down his window, talking to the men in the booth. The gates slid open and we pulled through, but my window stayed up. My nose wrinkled and I growled again. We drove past the main house and around a small road that was flanked by old trees. There was another gate here, but this time there were 20 men standing to the side. Great, my babysitters. I noticed a half a dozen motorcycles leaning against a fence post and snorted a chuckle. So, they were going to try to keep up with me, were they? Did they have any idea just how fast a werewolf could run if we put our mind to it? Suddenly, my tail started to slap the leather seat, very excited for the game that was about to begin. Yes, I was ticked and acting out. No, I wouldn't run off, but I was about to vent some serious frustration, and if they wanted to make a game of chase out of it, who was I to stop them? When the back door opened, Aunt Mary was the first out. Her voice bellowed in the quiet area outside. I watched Jonathan climb out, then I jumped out and stood next to him. I completely forgot all of them as the scents slid up and slammed into me. Heaven! I lifted my chin and inhaled breath after breath. It wasn't the Pax Forest, but it was delicious smelling. The aroma was nearly intoxicating. Trees, dirt, decay, wet moss, and the creatures that lived in that hidden world there. My senses were spinning and I was prancing, taking it all in and enjoying every single scent. Then a set of legs stepped in front of me and I snorted, looking up. Jonathan smiled and knelt. He was watching my face closely. I wondered if he could tell as much about my emotions in this form as he could in my other. Excited, he whispered, and I gave a happy bark. Seems he could. Another man knelt next to him, and I stiffened. Then Aunt Mary squatted next to him. She was pretty limber for her age. "Raina, this is Ronald Dawes, a very dear friend of mine," she smiled. I wondered how many very dear friends she had, but I looked back at the man. He was even a bit older than she was, and also full vampire. No surprise there. His brown hair was speckled with gray, but he was handsome, even in his jeans and heavy brown hunting jacket, with that bizarre orange vest over it. "Hello, Miss Blvd. It's a pleasure to meet you," he stated, and I wanted to laugh. Instead, I sat down, kept my ears up, and my body language friendly. I gave a small bark and let my mouth open relaxed. To a werewolf, it said, "Hello, it's nice to meet you too," without offer to get any more familiar than that. He seemed to understand, though, and he smiled again. "This place is very safe. It is completely fenced in, and no one comes around here." I snorted and nodded, which seemed to be the only way I could do that. Mr. Dawes turned his body a little, pointing to the large yellow bars that laid across the fence here. "It's a full 15 acres of woodland out there." I could hear the pride in his voice. He had every right to be. Holding down large pieces of land wasn't as easy as it used to be, at least without being noticed. The fence is substantial and also clearly marked. It's stone in some places, but wood and wire in others. He was giving me the layout of the place. As much as I appreciated it, my muscles were starting to twitch. I wanted to run. "There are 2 creeks that don't cross and one sizable gully," he pointed towards the east. "It's more of a ravine, so you shouldn't have to worry about any surprise terrain out there, as long as you have run in the woods before." He was talking like a tracker, very matter of fact, and was not belittling or condescending at all. I liked him. He turned back to me and then looked at Jonathan. "We have the men here," he stated. "I must admit I'm not sure why. This place is tight and safe. She won't have to worry about being bothered here." I smiled and my tongue flopped out. Yes, I did like him. Jonathan nodded. "Good. We just want to keep an eye on things." Tongue went back in. Great. Well, at least this perfect stranger didn't doubt me or my abilities. Maybe he had known werewolves, or maybe it was just the whole hunter thing. That was something we shared. Jonathan turned to me. "Now, about that second thing your father wanted." My lip curled and I growled, deep and then louder. I noticed Aunt Mary stood up, but Mr. Dawes didn't. "Is there something else Mr. Blvd needs my men to do?" he asked, raising a hand to wave over some of his men. "No," Jonathan stated quietly. "It's something, well..." He looked back, and me and Mr. Dawes stood up. "I'll leave it to you two, then. Just let us know when you're ready." He and Aunt Mary walked off, chatting like old friends. Jonathan looked back at me. "You can't really be serious," I hissed at him, lowering my head. His eyes softened. "Raina, I know you're angry with your dad, and with Michaud, about Paige." "Angry is an understatement," I growled, showing a bit of teeth. He nodded. "I agree. I'm sorry about that." "Why are you sorry?" "If I had known, maybe..." He looked down at his hands. I stepped up and nuzzled his chest. He put one arm around me, letting it rest on the back of my neck. "I'm so tired of seeing you hurt," he whispered, and I whimpered and rubbed my nose against him. "I promise I will not run off. Tonight," I stated, quickly jumping back and prancing to show I was being playful with the last comment. He chuckled and stood, shaking a finger at me. "You be careful in there," he stated. "If you get hurt..." Mr. Dons turned then and looked down at me, squatting again. Yeah, he had definitely been around werewolves before. Most two-legged people would stand and talk to us. He knew to come down to my level. "There are deer in there," he stated, his face now serious. Jonathan squatted next to him to listen. The older vampire nodded. "There are plenty of does, and I'm sure you could down them easy enough, but there's a few bucks in there, too." My brows rose, and so did Jonathan's. "Are bucks dangerous to her?" he asked. "Not if she stays away from 'em," the older man chuckled, still looking at me. He was talking, one hunter to another, his eyes and body language telling me as much as his words. He could see that I understood, so he turned to Jonathan. "A werewolf can down a doe alone if they've hunted before, but a good-sized buck," he shook his head, "they fight back." Jonathan's eyes narrowed, and the man nodded. "They are vicious in their own right, horns and hooves as well as teeth." Then he looked at me. "There is one buck in particular, Old Red we call him. He's a fighter and tough as they come." "Point taken," I stated, suddenly not as eager to go running through those gates. I had seen my pack take down a buck. It took 4 of them, with 3 more running point. They didn't come out without war wounds. Jonathan shook his head. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea." Mr. Dons threw his head back and laughed. "Come now, she can steer clear enough, and her nose will keep her to the safer parts." He nodded in my direction. "She has the eyes of one that has hunted a bit before. Still green, but not completely. She'll do just fine." Then he turned and looked over his shoulders. "Besides, my men know where they are, and they will be watching too. I would hate to have to lay down any of them," he looked back at me, "but I have given the order to down anything that might come too close." "I don't want him to have to do that," I barked at Jonathan, neither of us admitting I had never hunted before. But my boyfriend stood nodding. "Good. Are they armed?" I barked again, and he still ignored it as the 2 men walked over to where Michael and Martin were standing with the others. "Men!" I snorted and trotted over to them. There was a small cart with a man in the driver's seat. Aunt Mary walked over and knelt, smiling. "I hope you don't mind, dear, but I'm going to wait this one out in the house." I slapped my tail a few times and gave a bark that said I totally understand. She smiled and stood up, climbing into the other seat of the cart. She waved as they drove off, and I barked a few times. Then I threw back my head and howled, loud and long. Wow, that felt so good that I did it again. When I lowered my head, I saw the men looking at me. "What?" I thought. Mr. Dons winked at me, and I trotted over towards him. The motorcycles were now manned, and I saw that Michael was on one of them. I growled in his direction, and he turned away. Fine. Be that way. The others were standing around, and I noticed that they all had on the orange vests, and also had walkie-talkies strapped to them. Gads, all of this just so I could run. Then I saw one of them step up to the gate, and I twitched with excitement. I could have run and jumped it. It was only about 6 feet high, but I waited. Jonathan moved up next to me. "I'm going to be out there too. I want you to check in with me from time to time." "You're going on foot?" I asked, shocked. He didn't know this forest any more than I did. He nodded. "I'm going with 2 men, to watch on things." I snorted. You don't have to do that, you know." "I know," he chuckled. Then the gate opened. Mr. Dons turned to me and gave a half bow. "Enjoy yourself and feast." That was all it took. I bolted and leapt through the opening, disappearing into the night and ignoring the voices and motorcycles that followed me. It was amazing. My muscles opened up and I slammed my paws on the damp earth underneath. I inhaled deeply as the wind slapped my face, making my eyes water a little. I skidded to a halt just to feel the sensation, then pivoted and jumped over a small bush. I twisted and turned, relishing the release and the freedom. At first I ignored the sounds and smells of the small animals that scurried to get away from me. My body wanted to run, and I did just that. The forest was thicker in some areas, and I made a game out of maneuvering between the trees and tall brush while keeping my speed up. Agility training, you could call it, but it was wonderful. I skidded to a halt several times, twisting to leap off in another direction. At one point, I changed directions so fast that I slipped and rolled a few times. I jumped up, shook myself hard, my tongue falling out as my chest heaved. This was so much fun. I barked at a bush, lowering my front half, and growled playfully at it. Then I turned and bolted the other way, leaving the shivering bush alone. I slid to a halt at one point, my ears perked up. A motorcycle rolled into my view, and I saw Michael on the seat. I lowered my head, spread my front legs a bit, and growled loudly. Michael stopped the bike and watched me from across the small clearing. My wolf eyes let me see him clearly, and he wasn't smiling. I barked a warning, and he sat still, watching me. I lowered my front half more, and then charged. My eyes were locked onto his, but he didn't move as I tore towards him. When I was a few yards away, another bike rode up, and I turned and leapt, soaring just over the front wheel of the bike. My paws hit the ground, and I took off running, not looking back. I ran until my chest started to heave, and then I slowed to a trot. I found the ravine and trotted down into it, slipping in the damp dirt a few times, and even enjoyed that. I wasn't trying to be overly careful. When I reached the bottom, the pungent swamp-like smell filled my nostrils, and I lifted my head and howled again. That should do for checking in, I thought, and walked through the dense, marshy-type floor. There was a motorcycle at the top, and I glanced up, but couldn't see through the thick brush down here. The motor was idling, so they were planning to stay up there, knowing I was down here. I wondered if Michael had given them some way to track me, maybe through my necklace. It didn't matter. I stopped and inspected a fallen tree, sniffing at it and learning a little more about the life that stayed here. Just then, another scent caught my attention, and I looked up at the other side of the ravine. Deer, I thought, and I started up that side. I slipped a few more times and growled at the wet leaves that slicked this side. When I finally crawled up to level grounds, my legs and belly were thick in mud. I gave myself a hard shake and then lifted my nose up and inhaled again. The deer were to my right, and my curiosity turned me in that direction. I remembered what Mr. Don said. I wouldn't get too close, but I did want to see them. I trotted a bit, sniffing the air to make sure I was going in the right direction. A few minutes later, 2 motorcycles appeared, and one moved up close to me. "Head the other way," came Michael in a monotone voice. "Why?" I barked. "The bucks are getting agitated," he replied, keeping his voice hard. "They know you're here." "Good," I barked back and started to walk that way. He pulled his bike up to block my path. "You said you would keep away from them." I growled and snorted. Fine, I just wanted to look, I barked, then turned and took off in the other direction. When I slowed, I was snarling and growling. How dare he? I knew what I was doing, I huffed as I slowed to a hard walk. Blocking me and telling me to go somewhere else? The nerve! I stopped and sat down hard, still ticked. Normally, I wouldn't have minded so much, but he was high on my list, and there wasn't much he could do to change that. I sat there, mulling over my irritation, when that odd feeling tingled inside of me again. I froze, closing my eyes. What was this crazy sensation that had followed and taunted me? I sniffed the air, wondering if I could locate it, but only smelled the forest and the life here. Then I felt my heart squeeze and a sadness started to slip over me. I lowered my head, feeling the ache starting to grow. Something pulled my head up and made me look in a certain direction. My ears followed. The sadness grew and I let out a soft whimper, longing desperately for whatever kept pulling at me. If only I could remember what it was. There was something that told me I knew. It was right on the tip of my tongue, just where I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Suddenly, I heard a rustling to my left, and I turned my head. The trees were thick here, so I lifted my muzzle and inhaled again. Then my ears twitched. Deer! There was one only a dozen yards away. The sadness fell away, and I stood slowly, lowering myself closer to the ground and trying to see through the darkness. The lack of light was no problem for me, but I couldn't see through trees. Then I heard it moving, and my body lowered more. It wasn't moving away. It was coming closer. Deer had a good sense of smell, and I knew that the wind was soft, but was moving towards the deer, so it could smell me. Why is it coming this way? I thought, and then let my eyes drink in my surroundings. There was a larger bush to my right, and I slunk towards it, almost laying down next to it. Yes, I was jet black, but in the dense forest I would blend in with the night foliage, or at least look like a large shadow. I was still trying to figure out why the creature was coming my way when it stepped out into the area just a dozen feet to my left. My eyes widened. It was a massive buck, and it was looking right at me. Oh, crap, I thought, freezing and holding my breath. The gigantic creature snorted and tossed its head, letting me know it saw me and that I was not welcome. Animals, even ones that never encountered a werewolf, instinctively knew that there was something more to us. This buck either didn't have that natural knowledge, or more than likely, didn't care. Okay, I thought, I can easily outrun this thing. Which was true. Even a normal wolf could. But a werewolf was insanely fast, even in thick forest. The deer didn't advance, but he tossed his large antlers again, and then rose up and slammed his hooves on the ground, kicking up the dirt and leaves under him. I wasn't afraid, but I knew to be cautious with this new game. I watched the buck carefully, noticing every movement, and keeping my body completely still. All I had to do was bolt, and he would lose me quickly. But part of me was thrilled with the standoff. My adrenaline was throbbing, and the excitement made my mouth water. When the buck took a slow step forward, my hackles went up, and it stopped hard. I could see the creature's eyes, and it was fighting an internal battle that sent a wave of thrill over me. He wanted to run off the intruder. This was his land, but he also knew this intruder was dangerous. I slowly inflated myself, lifting my body a little higher off the ground. With my hackles, I now appeared nearly twice as large as I had a moment ago, and it noticed. It stomped the ground and threw its head back, but it stayed where it was. That excited me even more. I kept my eyes locked on it, careful to watch for any signs that it might have a rush of stupidity and charge me. Outrunning it was easy enough, but if I waited too long, those hooves and horns could cause some serious pain. I pulled back my lips just a little and let the slightest growl seep out, but it was deep and full of threat. I was not afraid. In fact, this game excited me so much it almost surprised me, but I wanted to make sure it knew not to push things. The buck snorted, but took one very small step back. Ha! It was now more afraid than angry. Instinct told it that I was a much greater threat than I appeared, and it wasn't stupid either. When I pushed up just a little more, now half standing, it reared up and slammed down on the ground, a final attempt to scare me off. I was smiling inside. I liked this. The rush, the focus, the pureness of it was amazing, and my body shivered with it. I let out another growl, again inching up just a bit. I was sizable, half again as large as a normal wolf. Whether it had ever encountered one or not, something told it to be afraid. If I was with my pack, the others would have snuck around downwind, and that creature would have been dinner several minutes back. Then we both heard a noise. Unfortunately, the sound was coming from behind the buck, so when it bolted, it headed straight towards me. I yelped and lunged, twisting and scrambling to get out of the creature's way as he flew past. Then I felt the pain as its back hoof kicked out and slammed into my side. I screamed out in agony, scrambling to my feet to prepare for another attack. It didn't turn to fight. I don't even think it realized what it did. It had been spooked by the motorcycle that was coming, and it was out of my sight before the pain reached my brain. My own instincts took over, and I limped to a nearby bush, pushing my way into it and laying down. I twisted my head and inspected the injury. I could smell the blood and sniffed at the wound. It was deep. The scent of torn muscle made me whimper. I licked at it, also out of instinct, and yelped again. Man, was that gonna be sore. I heard the motorcycle ride up. Then I heard Michael's voice. "Where are you?" His voice was hard and filled with concern, but I growled low. "I can smell the blood, Raina. I know you're hurt." "Great. Just great." "I'm fine," I barked, and then wanted to bite myself. That was just stupid. He walked over to the bush and literally ripped it in half, exposing me. He tossed the branches on the ground and looked at me, his eyes sliding down to my side. "They were supposed to be watching that thing," he hissed, ripping the walkie-talkie off his vest and putting it to his mouth. "She's been kicked and she's down," he roared into the thing. "I'm fine," I hissed. "I wouldn't have gotten hurt if you would have stayed away," I growled. Then he leaned down to inspect the damage closer. I yelped when he touched the skin near the wound, then turned my own head. "It can't be that bad. It's just a gash," I barked. He shook his head and looked at me. "That buck got you full force, Raina. You're hurt pretty bad." His words were sharp, but his eyes looked worried. "What?" "No, I'm not," I barked back, and turned to look at my side again. Okay, so it was bleeding. A lot. But it couldn't be that bad. It didn't even hurt that much, as long as I didn't move. Then my head shot up and I sniffed the air. That strange sensation came back to me hard. My eyes tried to search the forest over Michael's massive form. I barked loudly, I'm here, I let it say. Who was I trying to talk to? I had no idea, but I barked again and then yelped as the pain shut me up. Suddenly, the air was filled with voices and the sounds of motors. Great. So much for my fun. I snorted and laid on my side, suddenly feeling a strange heat around the wound. Something still tickled the back of my brain, but the pain was starting to push it further down. Michael turned. I need something, a board, a blanket, something to put her on. Now, he roared at them. Okay, now it was starting to hurt. Maybe the adrenaline kept me from feeling it before, but wow. Now my head was spinning a bit. How bad could it really be? Then I remembered the size of that buck. I pictured it when it had reared up and thrashed its hooves at me. Were back hooves bigger than the front ones, or were they all the same size? Suddenly, I let out a yelp as heat expanded. Now the pain throbbed every time my side rose and fell as I breathed. Jonathan was there now, and he knelt next to Michael. He pulled out a flashlight and clicked it on. Vampires had great night vision, but I was nestled into the ground in the leftover rubble of a large bush. They leaned over to inspect my injury. How bad is it? I asked, and Jonathan looked at me, his eyes wide and his jaw tight. That bad? I asked, and he nodded. Crap, I thought, and laid my head back on the ground. So much for a great night out. When would they ever let me do something like this again? Probably 2 days right after never, if I was lucky. I moaned. I would have been fine, I hissed. I had the game under control, but then Michael... The game? Jonathan asked, and I sighed. He was using that voice that my father used sometimes. What game were you playing? He asked, still holding the flashlight over the wound, and turning back to look at my side. Michael had stood and was talking to several men that had showed up. 2 of them had guns out. Michael spooked the buck, I told Jonathan as he sat down on the ground near my head. I wasn't being stupid. I had it under control. Did you know the buck was there? Well, yes, but it was just a game. Jonathan looked down at me and I moaned. Suddenly, my game didn't sound so smart. I lifted my head. I knew what I was doing. It was just a standoff, really. If he hadn't come and scared it. Jonathan nodded, looking over at the men. Well, let's get you out of here and fixed up, he said, and that it really doesn't matter. You were stupid, but that's not the point right now, voice. I laid my head back on the ground. Great, just great. Once again, I pushed too far, and once again, I created nothing but chaos. Finally, Michael stepped up. We have a makeshift gurney, but we'll have to walk her out. The trees are too thick. Jonathan nodded, and 2 men walked over with the contraption. I lifted my head, yelping as the pain throbbed harder. It was a board with a blanket over it. Michael knelt down and looked at Jonathan, who nodded. Michael and I are going to lift you, he explained. Then they'll slide the board under you. I gave a soft growl. It's just a scratch, Jonathan. He smiled at me. Really? Just a scratch? I lifted my head. Okay, a deep scratch, but it really isn't that big of a deal. I glared at Michael. I don't need to be carried out of here. Jonathan shook his head. Yes, you do. You can't walk all the way back like this. The air was filled with the smell of my blood. At least it was for me. I rolled onto my belly, the yelp coming out through my tight jaw. I didn't see Jonathan wave the men over as I pulled my legs underneath me and tried to push up. My front legs lifted, but when my back legs tried, the pain seared through me and I cried out. But the board was under me now, and I collapsed onto it. So maybe it was a bit more than a deep scratch, but I didn't really need to be carried. I yelped again as the two men stood and started to walk. Jonathan and Michael were on each side, and I wanted to make a sarcastic comment about his motorcycle. I didn't remember the ground being so bumpy, and the fire in my side was heating up by the minute. It was just a buck. I tried to picture the hooves again and closed my eyes. Yes, it was big. But I couldn't. It couldn't have done that much damage. It wasn't attacking me. It was running away. I just happened to be in the escape path. Jonathan kept one hand on the board and even snapped at the guys when one of them tilted it, and I yelped. After that, I grit my teeth and didn't cry out. My side was throbbing, my head was pounding, and I was covered in sweat by the time we finally stepped out of the forest. I moaned when I saw the lineup that was waiting. Aunt Mary rushed up to me, her eyes wide and her hands to her mouth. Mr. Dons was there with a duffel bag. He didn't look happy, but he was calm. "Lay her down here and let me have a look at it," he stated. "Not here," Michael hissed. Then he lifted his head and looked around. "We have to get her out of here, now." He turned to Martin, leaned into the man's ear, and then straightened as the other ran off. "We have to get that cleaned out," Mr. Don said as he stood looking at my side. "She can't start to heal with a wound that's dirty. She's got half the forest mangled in there." Michael let out a growl and then nodded. "Make it quick." The men took me and laid me down near the car. Mr. Dons knelt and leaned over my side. I opened my eyes and lifted my head, looking back at him. He was already opening his bag and pulling things out. "We need to get this cleaned up now, or it'll heal dirty," he explained. Jonathan knelt, and Michael stated that the car was ready and that the doctors had been called and were on their way to the house. "Clean her up quick," Michael snapped, his eyes moving all around the clearing. "This is going to sting quite a bit, I'm afraid," the older vampire stated as he opened a bottle and grabbed a handful of gauze. "I'll need a few of you to hold her down." Michael squatted down and took my back hips in his hands. Jonathan took my shoulders, and Mr. Jones shook his head. "Someone should hold her muzzle." My eyes opened wide, and Jonathan shook his head. "She'll be fine." The older vampire shook his own head, but Jonathan's elbow pushed down on my cheekbone and had held my head still as well. At first, all I could feel was cold, which actually felt good on the heat. Then the burn kicked in. I yelped and jerked, trying to twist away from the new pain. My body shook as the hands held me in place, and Jonathan tried to talk to me. I didn't hear anything he said. Whatever was being poured over me hurt more than the wound. My doctors had never poured anything like that on me. It was like being lit on fire, but with ice so cold it hurt. I whimpered and howled softly, Jonathan still talking to me. My eyes watered and my breathing was fast and hard. "He can't finish until you're still," he whispered. I shivered hard and stopped fighting. Then he started to clean the wound. Oddly enough, I barely felt that. I wasn't sure if it was just because he was being that gentle, or if what he poured on me had numbed me, or if it was just so minor compared to it. I was completely soaked with sweat and was shivering when he finally stopped. I whimpered when he lifted 2 large jugs from the ground. He handed one to Michael and the other to Jonathan, and then picked up a third. "Just water, miss. Have to try to get some of this mud off you. Don't need it sneaking into that wound now that I cleaned it." Jonathan unscrewed the top of his and started to pour it over my front legs, rubbing them with his hand. I had forgotten just how dirty I was. He emptied that jug and was handed another by a woman that I didn't see show up. I felt Mr. Dons and Michaud cleaning the rest of me, and the cool water felt good. Finally, the older vampire gave a hard nod. Okay, now I'll cover it and wrap it, and that should get her back to your place. He had to wrap the dressing completely around me, which meant I had to be lifted. I cried out as Jonathan and Michael lifted their ends up. Mr. Dons was fast and wrapped me within seconds, but I wasn't laid back down. They carried me to the car, and I was put on a pile of blankets that had been set on the floor. Tell him I'm sorry, I said as Jonathan climbed in. It was just a stupid accident. I really enjoyed the run. Jonathan only nodded. He knows, Raina. He understands. I sighed as Aunt Mary climbed in, being overly careful not to bump me. Martin looked in. I'll be riding back here, he stated, then climbed in and sat next to Jonathan, who was answering his phone. Yes, Mr. Blvd, we're leaving right now. I moaned. My dad. I would never be allowed to run again. Aunt Mary's. Yes, about an hour. The wound was cleaned well and wrapped. She'll be fine. Yes, I understand. Yes. No, we didn't. He listened a second longer, then clicked the phone and pushed it back into his pocket. Your dad and the doctors will be there as soon as they can. I closed my eyes, still laying on my good side, and forced myself to go to sleep. It worked for most of the ride. A few bumps made me yelp, but I drifted back off quickly. I was exhausted. When we got to Aunt Mary's, there was an actual gurney waiting. Where in the world they got one of those in the middle of the night, I would never know. Michael reached in from the door, and Jonathan lifted the front half of me. This time I didn't yelp, and they laid me on the soft padded stretcher. Aunt Mary rushed ahead and had them open the elevator. The ride up was silent. Inside her apartment, they decided I was better on the stretcher. It was soft, clean, and up high enough for when the doctors came. The sides were put up, I guess so I wouldn't fall off. Did they really think I would roll over? Jonathan moved it near the couch, lowering it some, and sat next to me. It doesn't hurt that bad anymore, I said, and he gave a small nod. I'm just so tired. He frowned, watching me, but only nodded again. He looked up at Michael, who pulled out his phone and walked off. What? What was so wrong with me being tired? I had just been through a lot. I closed my eyes and fell instantly asleep. The peace was nice, but was interrupted with a flurry of sound that slapped me awake. My dad was standing there now, and they carefully raised the bed. He smiled down at me, and my anger was quickly forgotten. I was glad he was here. I turned my head and saw the two doctors quickly opening bags. One stepped up to my head and put the stethoscope between my front legs. I watched his face as he listened. Then he lifted my front paw, found a spot, and held it. Checking my pulse, I assumed. How odd vampire doctors would know about those kind of things. I yelped then and turned my head. The other doctor was cutting away the bandages. Jonathan was by my head on the other side, and my dad had moved down with the other doctor. They were whispering, but my dad nodded and smiled, looking up at me. You're going to be just fine, he stated, as if he just finally believed that himself. The buck tore through the muscles pretty good, the doctor said, but whoever cleaned her up at the scene did a good job. There's no sign of dirty healing, and that's what we were worried about. I let out a deep sigh and laid my head down, relief flooding over me. That was a big deal. They were worried that I would start healing with all the grime and dirt from the forest still inside me. That was a very bad thing. I had heard the stories. I smiled inside. Remind me to send Mr. Dons a very big thank you, I thought, and Jonathan chuckled. Aunt Mary is already taking care of that. I will see to it as well, my dad said, most of the stress now out of his voice. He stepped up to my head. You gave us quite a scare there, sweetheart. He reached over and stroked my cheek. I whimpered and lifted my head, enjoying his touch. So, that was the big scare? I asked, turning to look at Jonathan. He shrugged. If you started to heal with any... Yeah, I know. Bad, bad, bad. Jonathan smiled, but he did a great job and the wound is clean. Nearly, the other doctor said. I am impressed, but there is just a little debris, mostly in the fur outside. The inside is impeccable. Whoever did this saved her from a very bad situation. My dad stroked my head. Well now, they will get you all finished up and then all you have to do is rest and heal, which should take... He turned. A week and she should be good as new, the doctor at my side shrugged. A week, I barked, and my dad chuckled. Then you will rest for that week. How long until it's safe for her to shift? Jonathan asked, and the smile fell from my dad's face. When I had hurt my neck, they wanted me to stay in wolf form. Wolves have more tolerance for healing, and also have more meat on them. With the location of the wound, which would be right under her rib cage on the side, I would say at least 2 straight days. If she has to shift after that, she will need to lay in bed. Depending on how she shifts, Yeah, got it. Depending on if I was breathing or non-breathing vampire, would decide how long it would take to heal in that form. I was just relieved this was the only reason they were so freaked out back there. The doctor cleaned the wound to his own satisfaction and then cleaned up my entire side. It would be good to clean the rest of her, he stated. She was rinsed off, but needs a thorough cleaning and get all the mud and forest debris off her. Can we put her in the tub? Jonathan asked, and the doctor shook his head. No, but we need to wash her up as best we can. Aunt Mary turned to Michaud. There are some buckets out on the patio. You can fill them with water. I will get wash rags and towels. Michael nodded and walked off. I remembered climbing out of the ravine and the state of my fur at that point. I lifted my head and looked down at myself again. The part around the wound was clean, but the rest of me was still pretty dirty, despite having several jugs of water used at the scene. My dad pulled up a chair and talked to me as the others gave me a bath as best they could. I hoped they weren't dripping mud on Aunt Mary's nice carpet, but she was right there telling me I had better not worry about that. How did she know? He's never going to let me go running again, I moaned, and Jonathan chuckled. My dad looked at him, and he told him what I said. My dad smiled. I would like nothing more, he winked, but I seriously doubt you would be okay with that. He reached up and rubbed my head. Man, that felt good. Next time, we will all just need to be a more careful. I wanted to look at Michael and glare, but the fight was out of me at the moment. I was so tired. Not so much from the pain now, just from the whole ordeal. Then my stomach made a growling noise on its own. My dad smiled, and Jonathan stood up and headed off. Now that is something I can take care of, he said as he went. I'm really sorry, Dad, I said in a whimper. I was having such a good time, and I was being careful. Okay, maybe I shouldn't have tempted fate with that buck, but it only charged when it got spooked. This is the one time I wish my dad could hear my thoughts, but he seemed to understand. I know this was just an accident, sweetheart. Just one of those things that happened. No one's fault. Well, that was still up for debate. but I was glad he wasn't pacing the room declaring I was to be locked away forever to be kept safe. Chapter 17. After I was sufficiently cleaned and fed, my dad had them move me to a bedroom. I reluctantly laid on the bed, but only after Aunt Mary threw a little fit when I tried to get down and lay on the rug. "Don't you dare lay on the floor, Raina Blvd," she exclaimed. "You will lay on that bed and be comfortable." For a wolf, the rug was comfortable, but I stayed on the bed and slept for 12 hours straight. Jonathan was there when I woke. I yawned and went to stretch, then yelped as I pulled the skin around the wound. He was at the bed and looking worried until I explained. "You need to stay still and let that heal," he said, sitting next to me. It's not that easy, I thought. It's one thing to tell a vampire to stay in bed and rest. It's quite another thing to tell a wolf to do it. He chuckled. "I suppose you're right, but you need to, regardless." Did Aunt Mary call and check on Paige? I had dreamt about her. Not a long or detailed dream, but I remembered worrying about her. "I'll ask her." "I miss her, Jonathan. I wish he hadn't sent her away." "I know you do. I think he might be regretting his decision a bit, but he did what he thought was right at the time." I sighed. That sounded like my dad, all right. I reached my nose over and nudged his hand. He smiled and stroked my head. "So, how to keep you still for the next few days," he teased. "Yeah, good luck with that," I snorted. Already my body wanted to get up, even to just walk around the room. Wolves weren't like vampires who needed to stay down when they healed. Our bodies needed to move. I went to roll onto my stomach and winced just a bit. "If you tear that wound, it'll take longer to heal," he said, with one brow raised in warning. Yeah, I knew that, but I had to at least shift positions a bit. I made it to my stomach and sighed. I'm already bored. He climbed up on the bed, turning sideways and stretching his legs out next to me. I lifted up enough to move forward so my head was by his hand. He put it on my head and stroked between my ears. "Is now a good time to talk about the mini manor?" he asked. I smiled and sighed. "Good as any." He nodded. "I like it. A lot." "So do I." "So it's settled then?" "I don't know. I know you want to be closer to the city, Jonathan. Plus, I know you wanted to do this on your own. And Aunt Mary and my dad got us a killer deal that I could have never squeezed out of those realtors," he laughed. I smiled and laid my head on his thigh. "So, you want to do it?" He shrugged. "It's a big step, buying a place together." When I looked at him confused, he laughed. "It means you're really stuck with me, you know." I barked and he shrugged. "Well, buying our first home together." I tilted my head and he winked. "It won't be our last. We vampires do have to disappear from time to time, and I also like to travel. But for our first place, I think it'll do." My muzzle stretched and I playfully nipped at him. He laughed and lifted my chin. "Aunt Mary will be thrilled, and I'm sure she already has crews standing by to start making the needed upgrades." "I bet she does." There was a soft knock on the door, and then I barked. It opened, and Aunt Mary walked in. She looked at the two of us, then at Jonathan. Suddenly, I felt like a pup. "We've decided on the mini manor," he announced quickly, and that did the trick. Her whole face lit up like a Christmas tree. She slapped her hands together and bounced. "Wonderful! I will make a few calls tomorrow and they can start on the upgrades while the paperwork is getting finished up." She smiled at me. "We can talk about the interior when you shift. since it would probably bore my nephew to have to sit and translate. Plus, I don't know a thing about it, I added, and Jonathan grinned. Allison called while you were asleep, he added, and I looked up at him. He shrugged. I told her that you got yourself into another situation and that you were going to have to stay shifted for the next few days. I let out a soft growl and he winked. She's coming by later to visit. Aunt Mary nodded. Yes, her and that nice boy Joel. 2 good friends you have there, she smiled, and I wished I could roll my eyes in this body, but I was excited that she was coming. Ooh, ask her about Paige. Jonathan did, and Aunt Mary turned, closed the door, and then came back. She is doing well, she stated, lowering her voice. Then she smiled. Better than well, actually. Better than well? I barked, completely confused. She nodded like a schoolgirl and sat on the edge of the bed. She's actually living here in town. She glanced at the door, then back, lowering her voice even more. And I was able to weasel it out of her that she and Michaud are still in touch. Really, I thought, and Jonathan said at the same time. She nodded triumphantly. It's a secret at this point. Paige wants Michaud to keep his job, and we both agree that your father will settle down soon enough, and then they won't have to hide. I tried to sit up and yelped. She gasped and put her hands out. No, don't you dare go getting all worked up, Raina. This is wonderful news, and I promise I will help them find time to see each other. She actually giggled then. Oh, I haven't had this much excitement in my life in decades. Aunt Mary slapped Jonathan's calf. This is absolutely a novel in the making. Jonathan shook his head, and her smile faded. She turned to me. Oh, dear, I didn't mean I'm enjoying your turmoil. She understands what you meant, Aunt Mary, he chuckled. We're both very glad about Paige and Michael, and thank you for finding that out. Her smile returned. Well then, seems I have some calls to make. She looked to Jonathan. Unless you want to be the one. I do get a bit carried away. He shook his head. I would be grateful. I have a wounded fiancé to entertain. It would take a world of weight off my shoulders if you would. She nearly jumped off the bed and hurried to the door. Don't you worry about a thing, she proclaimed. You two just relax. You heal, my dear. Aunt Mary will take care of everything, she announced, and then disappeared out the door, although we both noticed she left it slightly open. And that's where I'm going to end that.